Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host Jack Perks, and this week we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be releasing a different podcast each day leading up to October the 24th, which is the World Fish Migration Day. Now this is a one-day global celebration to create awareness on the importance of free-flowing rivers and migratory fish. Now if you check out the description, there'll be a link for worldfishmigrationday.com. Now today I've got Dr. Adrian Pinder, who is the fisheries scientist at Bournemouth University, but is also Director of Research at the Masheer Trust, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today, the Masheer, this iconic species found across Asia. And I wanted to delve in a little bit about why are Masheer so important, but also getting some of the different aspects of river conservation in different countries. Well, nice to have you on, Adrian.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me, Jack.
Yeah, I was in your neck of the woods a couple of weeks ago on the Froome. First time I've ever been to the Froome. It's Burton Fishery. Do you know that one? Or East Burton, I think it might be called.
Burton, yes, I do know it well. I've spent many hours electric fishing on those riches in the past. Yeah,
there was the guy who runs, or the guy who lives on the river, the keeper. I think Tom Rushton. I know his brother really well because his brother's a wildlife photographer. And they said, cool. Do you fancy having a day's grayling fishing on there? And I was like, yeah, I would love to. And I didn't realise how big that. I mean, I didn't catch any, obviously, but there's some fucking monster grayling there, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna make you green with envy now because my field laboratory is only a little bit further downstream of there.
Okay.
And I caught one 3 pound 8 ounces on Sunday. So,
Jesus,
that's the biggest one I've ever seen on our reach, at least.
Put a saddle on it. But
yeah, quite impressive.
I was hoping to do some filming, but it had coloured up a little bit, and I think I'm guessing if there's no rain, it clears up nicely. But it was a little bit mucky when I went.
It doesn't clear up quite as well as a lot of the other chalk streams.
Oh, does it not?
Yeah, various inputs. Once it's rained, it will hold its colour for longer. Best time for filming would be in the summer.
Okay. But of course, we're not here to talk about grayling and chalk trees, as I'm sure we could waffle on about that as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about Masheer. And I thought this would be really interesting because most of these podcasts this week have been about UK fish conservation. But of course, it's World Fish Migration Day, and it's to do with all things all over the world. And with your research director hat on for the Masheer Trust, you do a lot of work with them. So I just wondered, for people that don't know, what is a Masheer? Because many people may have not heard of that fish before.
Okay, well, funnily enough, a lot of people, when they hear the name Masheer, they think it's a single species. In actual fact, there's probably over 40 species of Masheer, but these are spread across 3 genera, Neolysicylus, Nazarator, and Tor. But it's commonly accepted that the true Masheers are limited to the genus Tor. Now, I think this is the first time I've been asked to describe a Masheer without the use of visual aids. And I'm sure you've been in my talks before, Jack, where you just put up a picture of somebody holding a gigantic Masheer and everybody goes, wow, and they get it straight away. But without the use of a photo, basically we're talking about cyprinids, so members of the carp family. But what's special about these fish is they've got the potential to grow to massive sizes, qualifying many of these species as megafauna, meaning they grow in excess of 45 kilograms. So there's some of the biggest freshwater fish on the planet. Now, I appreciate many of your listeners won't be into fish, but most people will know what a carp looks like. So for those who do know about fish, if you think about half carp, half barbel, you won't be too far off the mark. But what characterizes the Masheer is the size of their scales. They've got enormous scales. So if you look at the palm of your hand, Jack, scales are the size of a adult human palm of a hand. That's on a moderately sized fish. And as well as protecting the fish in these harsh environments they live in, they've also been historically reported to be used as playing cards as well in the past.
Is that right?
I mean, these fish, they've also got big mouths, but they come in a range of beautiful colours as well. So silvers, golds, reds, some fish with brilliantly coloured blue fins. So they're really quite attractive. And because of their reputation as being one of the hardest fighting freshwater fish in the world, they have iconic status among anglers globally as well.
Because wasn't it, I think you kind of old British Empire, the guys who go and shoot a tiger or something. Often when they're not shooting tigers, they'd be fishing for Marcia as well, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it was Jim Corbett who championed this transition. He was a famous hunter, tracking tigers and shooting them, and he had a passion for catching Marcia and decided that catching Marcia was a greater sporting challenge than shooting a tiger. And this became this then sort of spread throughout the community, and it resulted in colonial hunters putting down their guns in favour of salmon rods, trying to catch these giant fish. And with that, there's lots and lots of stories of smashed rods, mangled hooks, and broken lines. So, yeah, I mean, this is where the reputation of the fish all stems from.
Wow, I'd love to. Okay, it's one of those things I'd love to see at some point. So what are they eating then? Are they predators? Are they omnivores? What do they do?
Yeah, they're predators, but they'll eat absolutely anything, and that goes from grazing algae off rocks to eating largish fish, crabs, things like that. But they're opportunists. They'll eat what's ever available, and that a really nice example of that is how they will fill their boots on falling fruits when various fruits come into season. So these things are living in jungle rivers, typically with heavily tree-lined margins, and certainly in the Western Ghats, where I've done a lot of work, we have mango trees overhanging and fig trees, and as these fruits mature, you get a little breath of wind, they'll fall onto the water surface, and these fish are there waiting, ready to just smash these things. And we've caught them on these baits as well. You hook a little mango, not the sort of size mango that you would buy in a supermarket here, but smallish mangoes. You'd hook them and chuck them out, and they will grab what's ever available to them.
So in feeding, they're almost like a chub on steroids then.
Absolutely. I mean, on steroids is a good way of describing Marcia, however whatever it is you're trying to describe about them.
And you mentioned size. So what's you said over 45 kilograms. Is that the kind of biggest they get? What's the sort of upper reaches of Marcia?
50. I think 54 is the 54 kilograms.
So I'm trying to work out in pounds. What's that? That's well over 100 pounds, isn't it?
Yeah. So we've had reports of fish. Well, we've had reports of fish much larger, but photographic evidence of fish that have been weighed at 130 pounds. But the British record, the world record was a fish of 120 pounds caught from the River Carvery in 1946, I think, from memory. Don't quote me on that.
No,
I'd want to check my records, but yeah.
So would fish of that size, I mean, I'm guessing there's nothing anywhere near that now, or is it a case of there's the odd monster lurking?
Yeah, there are, Jack. It's there's two in terms of the Marcia. There's within the genus Tor. I'll just tell you a little bit about the range of different species, and then we'll come back to that. But until recently, Fishbase was listing about 40 different species of Marcia, of which 23 or 24 were considered to be valid. But based on work that we've done over the last few years, we found evidence to support the validity of 16 different species of Marcia, which are spread across the mountain, across the fast-flowing rivers of South and Southeast Asia. So that goes from sort of Pakistan across to Myanmar in the Himalayas, and then down through India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, across to Vietnam, and down into Malaysia and Indonesia. But it's two species that tend to stand out, which seem to be have been studied most, and that anglers have been interested in over all these years. And that is the very, very different beasts. But one of them is the Himalayan golden mahseer, which is found in the Himalayan rivers. And the other one is the humpback mahseer which is endemic only to the River Kaveri system in South India. Now, although there's reports of the Himalayan fish growing to 8 feet long, 9 feet long, these records have never been validated. I think it's just something that somebody had written once, and it's just been propagated through the literature. But the humpback mahseer, that's the largest fish on record. And we've had records of that one up to about 130 pound, anecdotal evidence of fish 150 pound plus. So yeah, they get massive.
They're big boys.
Yeah.
So what is the Mahseer Trust trying to do then?
There's sort of a multi-pronged approach, really. So the primary objective was to draw attention to these fish, and act as a sort of central hub of information to encourage anglers, scientists, conservationists to engage, understand the importance of these fish, and try and encourage greater levels of research into them to understand more about them and facilitate their conversation. Beyond that, and more recently, what we've been focusing on is how we use mahseer as flagship species to draw attention to the importance of more holistic river conservation, and drawing people's attention to the fact that we need rivers, we need clean, functional rivers. This is the water we rely on to drink, to grow our crops. Without rivers, we are stuffed. And having healthy, functional ecosystems is a good sign that those resources are going to be more sustainable into the future, particularly against the backdrop of climate change and growing populations and the increasing stress that we're putting on these systems.
So, I mean, I guess you kind of answered it a little bit there then, but what are the main threats that Mahseer face then?
Okay, people, like everything else. It's a common problem with fish, that because people don't see them, they're sort of out of sight and out of mind, and they're not really considered as wildlife. So people tend to ignore them. But in terms of, unless they want to eat them, of course. So that's among one of the key threats. And in India, where people are in rural areas are generally poor, catching these fish by whatever means is important to put food on the table, but that results in very unsustainable fishing methods, which are illegal. But we're talking about dynamite fishing, poisons, small mesh nets. So all these methods are non-discriminate, and they will kill everything in the area, all species and all life stages, with the younger life stages being particularly vulnerable to a dynamite blast. So although fishermen may take one fish from the pot, the damage that they have done accumulates down a reach to decimate stocks. So that's one thing, that's the exploitation. But there's all the other things associated with population growth as well. So there's pollution, there's abstraction, so very little water being left in these rivers during low flow seasons. So a lack of water, and then which brings us direct to World Fish Migration Day, the dreaded dams, which when people talk about migratory fish, they typically think about diadromous fish, which move between freshwater and the sea to spawn, or vice versa. Things like salmon, eels, shads, etc., etc. What a lot of people don't appreciate is many freshwater species are also long-distant migrants as well, relying on free passage between nursery areas and spawning areas to be able to complete their life histories. And Masheer fall into that category. They are long-distance migrants that need to be able to access upstream areas, tributaries, smaller streams to get into, which they migrate to during the monsoon to lay their eggs and spawn. And another thing that's overlooked with the dams as well is it's not just, people talk about the blockage of fish getting to spawning grounds. It's not just that. Even if you provide a fish pass, and assuming that fish pass works, and fish are able to get up there, what goes up must also come down. So the reason fish swim upstream, these rheophilic fish swim upstream to spawn, is to account for their eggs and larvae drifting downstream to populate the downstream reaches. Now, in doing that, many of these fish, particularly with the hydroelectric dams, is those fish don't have anywhere to go other than straight through turbines. I can't think of a single river within the Masheer Range countries, and there may be some. Most of them don't have fish passes in the first place, so this isn't an issue. But where larvae are drifting down, I'm not aware of any of these infrastructures across this area that have any sort of screening or deterrence to stop these young fish from entering the turbines. So even if fish can get up, the chances are many of their offspring will be killed as they drift downstream.
Just get minced up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's with the Masheer Trust, although you're under the banner of Masheer, you're going to be benefiting a whole host of other species that live in the river. But why are Masheer so crucial? Why have you chosen the Masheer then as this flagship species?
Okay, yeah, you mentioned the word flagship.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. And I also mentioned about out of sight, out of mind, and this is something that fish in general struggle with. Charisma, unless you're really into your fish like we are, Jack.
Yeah.
People don't consider fish as charismatic species like the giant panda, for instance, your classic flagship species. So we have to work with what we have, but these fish are the biggest, some of the biggest freshwater fish in the world. They're really important in a religious context as well. So there's cultural importance here. So this goes back to the Hindu god Vishnu. First incarnation was half man, half fish, with big scales, considered to be half Masheer, and this has led to temple sanctuaries that protect these fish. So these fish sort of are on the radar in terms of religion and culture. So that they provide a perfect opportunity, really, to use as a flagship to draw attention to everything else that lives in the river. But you also, you just asked why they're so important. So there's the flagship element, but you've heard of umbrella species, yeah?
I know the term, but I'll be completely honest with you. I don't know what it means. So go on, no, you tell me what does it mean?
No, that's great. So that demonstrates my point brilliantly, because a lot of people use the terms flagship and umbrella and indicator and tend to get these things a bit muddled about what they actually mean. But as a sort of top predator, and because they've got such a large a large home range, and they need a long stretches of river to be able to complete their life cycles. These fish can be considered as umbrella species, because if you've got a stretch of river that's accommodating the self-sustainability of Marcia populations, that means that everything else can reach their migratory, their spawning grounds as well. So if you've got Marcia, it also indicates that the water quality is good. It indicates that there's lots of other smaller fish as well. The food chain's complete to have those big predators there. So yeah, they qualify as umbrella species, and if you can manage a watercourse and make sure there's Marcia are doing well there in a self-sustainable way, then other species are going to benefit as well. And I'm not just talking about aquatic species necessarily, all the other associated fauna in the food chain as well. Like, I mean, the rivers we're working on, you've got crocodiles that eat fish, you've got eagles, otters, all sorts of things that are intimately connected with the fish fauna. So there's a whole host of wildlife that benefits from Marcia being present.
I suppose it's a bit like shad in the UK, because they're not very good leapers. If shad can get up a weir, then more or less most fish species can get up a weir. So I guess they'd be classed as an umbrella species as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so well, I don't know. Different fish have got different. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe I should have thought about that a little bit more, because you've got things like lamprey, which have got more specific migratory needs.
Okay.
But yeah, certainly if Marcia are getting around, it suggests that there's no big dams, and if there's no big dams, then that means that all fish can move around freely.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned about the religious significance of Marcia. Is it right? I seem to remember like watching, might have been River Monsters or one of those, but you'll get these temples on the edge of these rivers, and they'll be almost like pet Marcia. You'll get these vast shoals hanging around the temples, and I think that they're protected, or in some cases they are.
No, that's absolutely right, Jack. I mean, in terms of, we can talk a little about conservation before we sign off, but yeah, this is one sort of mechanism, or one sort of attempt at Marcia conservation. So these pools are sacred, and in many cases have been there for many years. And people will go to visit the temple, and they will sell things like puffed rice, bits of popcorn and stuff, that people can go down and feed these fish. But what you've got there is you've basically got a lot of them are like aquaria, really, where you've got this bloody great big shoal of big Marcia in there. But in terms of conservation, that only works if you haven't got any other threats. These fish are subject to all the other threats that come down the river, such as pollution, such as being able to reach spawning grounds to spawn. But one of the most unfortunate things that we've observed in these temple pools, particularly in the rivers of southern India, is due to one of the other conservation projects to try and conserve Marcia, which has been aquaculture and breeding, artificially breeding Marcia and stocking them into rivers. Now, what's happened with this is aquaculturists have found the easiest Marcia species to breed, and have bred them en masse and shipped them out to all different places across the country, which means that some species have been introduced beyond their native range. And what we're finding in rivers where, one good example is the river Kaveri, where we have the humpback Marcia, and through our earlier research managed to actually associate to provide it with its first valid scientific name. And of course, without that, you can't do you can't assess the conservation status of that fish. That has since allowed us to assess it on the IUCN Red List as critically endangered, the only one of the 16 Marseilles which is critically endangered. But in the river where this fish should be, what we're seeing in the temple pools now is massive numbers of the bluefin Marseille, which is Tor Kudri, which has been produced en masse by hatcheries and introduced to the river. So the humpback Marseille, and one of the reasons it's become critically endangered is because of this additional pressure of non-natives, which have been put into the river in a sort of pseudo conservation interest, which hasn't really worked.
And is it? Am I right? Is it they hybridize, or some of them hybridize, and that's an issue as well?
But that at the moment, this is more of an assumption than proven. But this is something that we are looking at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll end on this last one because it's interesting to hear the pressures of river conservation all over the world. But how does it differ to say somewhere like the UK to river conservation somewhere like India, where you're working with these Marseille?
In terms of,
well, I'm guessing some things are the same, but I mean, there's going to be different pressures in different countries, aren't there? I don't know if there are different priorities. Like, I guess, where, like you mentioned, there aren't many fish passes on a lot of these rivers, are there, and things like that. So that's going to be a difference.
Yeah, and it goes back. So, you know, in this country, we're, you know, although we might, you know, accuse authorities of getting things wrong in this country and not doing enough for river conservation, we do have a pretty good awareness of the needs of fish in this country. And while we are pulling down dams to facilitate fish migration, the speed that they are going up and big dams across Asia is absolutely frightening, which takes us back to the fact that fish are out of sight, out of mind. And in terms of legislation, I'm focusing more on India now because it's the area that I'm most familiar with, having done most of my work there. But you've got one example is you've got the Indian Wildlife Protection Act, which is there to protect wildlife. But in the descriptions of wildlife, you know, you've got birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, etc., etc. Fish are not mentioned, so they don't even count legally as wildlife within the Wildlife Protection Act, which affords them no protection. There are other things like the National Wildlife Action Plan, which came out a couple of years ago, which has action specifically to do with the stocking of fish and the protection of and conservation of the humpback Marseille and the golden Marseille. The problem is that there just isn't anybody there's a whole list of people who should be responsible for actioning these things, but because there is no specific organisation responsible, nobody picks it up, so nothing gets done. And we're talking about a rapidly growing economy where the emphasis is on growth, power, production, and fish don't feature in that, unfortunately.
I guess it's similar to the UK, say, in the Industrial Revolution, during the Industrial Revolution, where there were all these, you know, weirs being put in and for power and whatnot, and fish weren't overly thought about then. But
yeah, I would say the key difference, unfortunately, is the areas that we're talking about where we find Marseille. We're talking about biodiversity hotspots. So in India alone, you've got the Western Ghats and the Himalayas. So we're talking about really diverse aquatic fauna. And as we've seen with one of the biggest freshwater fish in the world, the humpback Marseille, that has nearly gone extinct without intervention. And this is a fish that grows to, you know, 130, 150 pound in weight. Now, if fish like that are going extinct, how many species are we losing that we're not aware of, that we're losing before we've even named. And that's one thing that's not going to be, although we've managed to correct things in this country and bring things back, we can't bring species back that have gone extinct. And some of these species may be critical to the function of those ecosystems. So yeah, there's a lot of damage being done and continuing to be done, really.
Yeah, which is an awful shame, but it's a lot to think about. And I didn't really know that much about Masheer going into this, apart from being big scaled and having whiskers. So I've learned a little bit more about that, and I think I know what umbrella species means now. Got the concept of that as well. So it's been great having you on, Adrian, and hopefully that'll enthuse the listeners to go and check out the Masheer Trust.
Yeah, please do. There's loads of information on there.
Cool. All right, take care.
Yeah, and thanks for having us on, Jack. Take care of yourself.
That was Adrian Pinder talking a little bit about Masheer. And I should just say as well, on a more positive note, that Adrian with the Masheer Trust and also Shoal are working together on an initiative called Project Masheer to try and help and conserve them and get a little bit of work done. So there is hope for Masheer. It's not all doom and gloom for them. Now don't forget, the 24th of October is World Fish Migration Day, and leading up to that and on the day there's going to be loads of fishy related content from all over the world. Now you're best positioned to see this from the World Fish Migration Day website, or of course you can follow them on Twitter and Facebook on worldfishmigrationday.com. That'll have all the relative links. Now tomorrow, in the final podcast for the World Fish Migration Day series, I have got Charles Crudwell, and he's going to be talking a little bit about shad on the River Severn and the Unlocking the Severn project. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's podcast. This has been the Bearded Tits podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I will catch you tomorrow. Cheers.